Yeah, so the New York Times was reporting on a climate panel that the White House is putting together to explore the impact of climate change in national security. And what caught my eye was the headline. So, this is, again, the New York Times news article: White House climate panel to include climate denialist. And I found that really striking because, I mean, climate denialist is supposed to be an equivalent of a crank. And if we're having important policies, including security policies decided by cranks, like that is something that I would find really troubling. And so if you look into the story, there's one person that they know is going to be in the panel. And this is the so-called denialist, William Happer. And so he's a Princeton physicist who's been involved in atmospheric physics since the 1970s. He headed the Department of Energy's Department of Science, and probably most important on his resume, a former Power Hour guest. And
he brags about it all the time.
Yeah. So I was curious, all right, well, what does his denial consist of? And in the whole New York Times story, you really don't get an answer to that. They quote one email from him where he says, more CO2 will benefit the world. The only way to limit CO2 would be to stop using fossil fuels, which I think would be a profoundly immoral and irrational policy. So whatever you think of that, it's not obvious that he's denying anything. It's at most you get the sense that he thinks that there's benefits of CO2 that outweigh the risks. And so I went into Wikipedia, which usually gives you kind of a good high level introduction into controversial figures and their views. And what Wikipedia says, it quotes him saying, some fraction of the 1 degree Celsius warming during the past 2 centuries must have been due to increasing CO2, which is indeed a greenhouse gas. So it doesn't sound like he's denying that much. And then it goes on to say most of the warming has probably been due to natural causes. So, like, whether you agree or disagree with that, to put that as in the same category as somebody who would say the earth isn't warming or CO2 has no climate impact, which is what I think a phrase like climate denialist does, seems really misleading. And I mean, the Wikipedia page is interesting because it follows that with a quote refutation where it just quotes one of his opponents saying his claims simply aren't true. And like this whole phrase of climate denier, climate denialist, like I think this is really common how it's used, right? It's not trying to clarify. It really is similar to like anybody who's being shouted down for a politically incorrect opinion by calling them a racist or a sexist. It's saying like, look, your view's outside the tribe. And there's a really good analysis of this sort of phenomenon by a philosopher we all like, Ayn Rand, where she calls this the argument from intimidation. And it's basically you're trying to stifle or silence a debate. And so you assert the falsehood of a view arbitrarily, and then you use that to prove somebody's immorality. So we don't have to engage Happer's arguments. We don't have to ask, why does he think CO2 is a benefit? What's his evidence? What does he think of the, conventional evidence? It's just, he doesn't agree with the quote consensus, and therefore he's immoral, and therefore Trump is doing something nefarious by putting him on a climate panel.
Yeah. So the fact that there's just no, I mean, why not just explain, okay, this is what Happer says, here's why it's wrong, and just be very clear about that versus that, as you're pointing out, yeah, there's no focus on that at all. And then what he says seems very reasonable. Interestingly, there's a guy named Andrew Dessler, who's one of these, he's a kind of Michael Mann type in terms of he's a climate scientist. I think he's a climate scientist who's a popularizer of mainstream climate science. And on Twitter, he claimed to have a thorough takedown of Happer. And at least I thought this was, I haven't looked into it, but and he was criticizing his use of sources or something like that. But at least I thought, okay, this is the kind of thing that you should be trying to do. You should be trying to explain, this is where this person goes wrong. This is where he doesn't think he knows. This is where he doesn't know what he's talking about, that kind of thing. Now, I have little confidence that this critique is going to be that effective, in part because just looking a little bit at Dessler, he is a renewable energy, like a big advocate of it, and making a lot of irrational claims about solar and wind. Now, that's not his expertise, but the fact that he feels confident in making these claims outside of his area of expertise makes me think that he's in general just ideologically disposed. Nevertheless, that'll be something interesting to look at, and that's at least the kind of thing that you should do.